They found my last patient's file on my desk 3 days after I disappeared. And the police report said the pages were covered in something that wasn't ink and wasn't blood. Something that made the forensics team vomit when they tried to analyze it under UV light. I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, clinical psychologist specializing in criminal pathology, and for 8 years, I've sat across from the worst humanity has to offer. The killers who smile when they describe what they did. The monsters who sleep soundly while their victims' families never will. But nothing in my training, nothing in 2 decades of studying the darkest corners of the human mind prepared me for patient 347. The man who knew my daughter's middle name, even though I'd never told anyone at Blackwood Psychiatric Facility that I even had a daughter. The first time I saw him was a Tuesday in late October. One of those gray autumn days where the light seems wrong somehow. And I remember thinking the fluorescent bulbs in interview room C were flickering more than usual, casting shadows that moved independently of the people in the room. And when the guards brought him in, shackled and shuffling, he looked so ordinary that I almost laughed, almost broke protocol, and asked if they'd brought me the wrong patient, because this couldn't be the man they'd found standing over 17 bodies in that warehouse in Philadelphia. 17 people arranged in a pattern that made 3 separate detectives quit the force rather than keep investigating. He was thin, maybe 5'10", with receding brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses that kept sliding down his nose, wearing the standard orange jumpsuit that hung loose on his frame. And when he sat down across from me, the chains rattling against the metal table, he smiled this gentle, grandfatherly smile and said, "Dr. Chen, how nice to finally meet you. I've been looking forward to this conversation for such a long time." And there was something in his voice, some quality I couldn't identify, that made my skin crawl even though he hadn't said anything threatening or unusual. I went through my standard opening protocol, establishing boundaries, explaining confidentiality limits, asking basic intake questions about his background and mental state. And he answered everything politely, almost cheerfully, telling me about his childhood in suburban Ohio, his career as an accountant, his wife who'd died of cancer 5 years ago, his 2 grown sons who'd stopped visiting him in jail. And the whole time his eyes never left mine, never blinked, just stayed fixed on my face with an intensity that felt physical, like he was reading something written on my forehead that I couldn't see. 40 minutes into the session, I asked him about the incident, the 17 bodies, the pattern they'd been arranged in that reportedly formed some kind of symbol when viewed from above. And his smile widened slightly, and he said, "Oh, Sarah, we both know those people were already dead long before I found them. Dead in all the ways that matter. And I simply helped their bodies catch up to the reality of their souls. And I should have ended the session right there. Should have called the guards and filed my report and recommended he be transferred to a maximum security facility with experience handling delusional patients. But instead I heard myself ask, 'What do you mean they were already dead?' And he leaned forward, chains scraping against metal, and whispered, 'The same way you've been dead since Grace drowned.' The room went cold, actually physically cold. I could see my breath misting in the air. And Grace was my daughter's middle name, Emily Grace Chen. And she hadn't drowned, but I'd had a recurring nightmare about it ever since she was born. A horrible, vivid dream where I'd find her face down in our pool, and no matter how fast I ran, I could never reach her in time. And I'd never told anyone about that dream, not my ex-husband, not my therapist, not my best friend, no one. So there was no possible way this man could know about it, unless he'd somehow been inside my head, inside my memories. And I stood up so fast my chair fell backwards, and I was shouting for the guards. But he just kept smiling, kept talking even as they grabbed his arms to drag him out, saying, "She's 7 now, isn't she? 2nd grade at Meadowbrook Elementary, Mrs. Patterson's class. She sits in the 3rd row by the window, and last Thursday she drew a picture of a man standing in your backyard, and when Mrs. Patterson asked who it was, Emily said it was her friend who visits at night when you're asleep." And then he was gone. Pulled through the security door, but his voice seemed to linger in the room like smoke. And when I tried to leave, my legs wouldn't work properly, and I had to sit on the floor for 20 minutes before I could stand, before I could breathe normally, before I could convince myself that he'd just made a lucky guess, that there was some rational explanation, even though I knew, God help me, I knew there wasn't. I called Meadowbrook Elementary from my car, hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. And when I asked Mrs. Patterson about Emily's drawings, she got quiet for a long moment and then said, "Dr. Chen, I was actually planning to call you about that. Emily's been drawing the same figure in almost every art session for the past 2 weeks. A tall man with no face standing in various locations, your house, the playground, the classroom. And when I ask her about it, she just says, he's nice, and he tells her stories." And I think I said thank you, and I think I hung up properly. But the next thing I remember clearly is standing in Emily's school, pulling her out of class 3 hours early. And she was confused and a little scared because I was crying, and I never cry in front of her. I learned to compartmentalize after the divorce, after the incident at my previous job that I don't talk about. But I couldn't stop the tears as I buckled her into her car seat and drove us to my sister's house in Connecticut without even going home to pack bags. My sister Rachel asked questions, of course, wanted to know why we were showing up unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon with nothing but the clothes we were wearing and panic in my eyes. And I couldn't tell her the truth because the truth sounded insane. So I lied and said there'd been a gas leak at the house and we needed somewhere to stay for a few days. And she believed me because Rachel always believes me. She's believed every lie I've told since we were children, since the incident in the woods behind our house when we were 12 that we both agreed never to discuss. That thing we saw that couldn't have been real, but we both saw it anyway. Emily seemed normal that evening, playing with her cousins, eating dinner, watching cartoons. And I started to wonder if maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe patient 347 had just made some educated guesses based on publicly available information, and coincidence had done the rest. But then, at bedtime, Emily asked if her friend was going to visit her at Aunt Rachel's house. And I felt something inside my chest go tight and cold. And I asked her, keeping my voice carefully neutral, "What friend, sweetie?" And she said, "The tall man. The one who stands in the yard. He says he knows you from work, and he wants to help you remember something important. Something you forgot a long time ago that you need to remember before it's too late." And she said it so casually, like she was talking about a teacher or a neighbor. And I wanted to scream, wanted to grab her and run. But instead I kissed her forehead and told her there was no tall man. She'd just had a dream. And she looked at me with this pitying expression, this look of adult sadness on her 7-year-old face, and said, "Mommy, you always say things aren't real when you're scared of them. But saying something isn't real doesn't make it go away. You know that, right?" And I had to leave the room before she could see me fall apart completely. I didn't sleep that night. Sat in Rachel's guest room with every light on, scrolling through patient 347's case files that I'd technically violated protocol by downloading to my personal tablet, reading and rereading the police reports, the witness statements, The forensic analysis. And the more I read, the less sense any of it made, because the 17 victims had nothing in common: different ages, races, genders, socioeconomic backgrounds, no apparent connection to each other or to the killer. They'd just all gone missing within a 3-week period and then been found arranged in that symbol in the warehouse. And here's what the reports didn't emphasize enough: what I'd missed during my first review of the case. Every single one of them had been seeing a therapist at the time of their disappearance. Every single one had been in treatment for the same specific condition: persistent nightmares and waking visions of a tall figure without a face. The forensic psychologist who'd interviewed patient 347 before me had noted in her report that he'd told her things about her past that were impossible for him to know. Personal details, childhood memories, and she'd requested to be removed from the case, citing methodological concerns, which is professional code for "this is fucking with my head too badly to continue." And I should have read that report more carefully before agreeing to take the case, should have paid attention to the warning signs. But I'd been so confident in my abilities, so sure that my experience with dangerous patients had prepared me for anything. Wednesday morning, I called in sick to work, first time in 6 years, and I spent the day researching, going down rabbit holes on the internet, finding forum posts and blog entries about similar cases, therapists who'd reported patients who knew impossible things, facilities where inmates had demonstrated inexplicable knowledge about staff members' private lives. And there was a pattern if you looked closely enough. A thread connecting dozens of cases across the country over the past decade. Always involving someone in psychiatric custody. Always involving knowledge that shouldn't exist. And in almost every case, the therapist or doctor involved had either quit their job shortly afterward or disappeared entirely, just stopped showing up to work, and their families filed missing persons reports, but no one was ever found. I found one blog maintained by a former psychiatric nurse in Oregon who claimed she'd worked at a facility where 3 separate inmates had told her about her stillborn brother, the baby her mother had lost at 7 months pregnant when the nurse was 5 years old, a tragedy her mother had never discussed, and that existed only in a single hospital record from 1983. And the nurse had written post after post trying to make sense of it, developing elaborate theories about shared consciousness and collective memory and telepathic abilities triggered by extreme psychological states. And then her blog had stopped updating 3 years ago, mid-sentence. Literally, the last post ended in the middle of a word. And when I searched for her name, I found a missing persons case that had gone cold after 6 months. But the real horror was yet to come. Because on Wednesday night, after I'd finally managed to fall asleep around 3 a.m., exhausted from anxiety and research, I had a dream that felt wrong from the very beginning. Too vivid, too detailed, the colors too bright and the sounds too clear. And in the dream, I was back at Blackwood Psychiatric Facility. But the building was wrong somehow. The hallways stretching longer than they should. Doors appearing in walls where no doors existed. And I was looking for patient 347 because I knew he had answers. Knew he could explain what was happening if I could just find him. And I walked through those impossible corridors for what felt like hours. Passing rooms full of patients who all turned to look at me as I passed, all wearing the same expression of profound sadness. And finally I found a door labeled Interview Room C. But when I opened it, the room was vast, cathedral huge. And patient 347 was standing in the center, wearing a suit instead of his jumpsuit. And behind him was the symbol, the pattern from the warehouse. But it wasn't made of bodies anymore. It was made of light, burning bright enough to hurt my eyes. And he said, "Dr. Chen, I'm so glad you're finally ready to remember." And when I looked down at my hands, they were covered in that substance, that not ink, not blood material the police had found on the case file. And I was writing something on the walls, writing in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. And the writing said, "They were never alive. We are not who we think we are. The forgetting was necessary, but now it's time." And then patient 347 reached up and removed his face like it was a mask, and underneath there was nothing, just empty space where a face should be. And he said, "You've been asleep so long, Sarah. Don't you want to wake up?" And I tried to scream, but I couldn't make any sound. Couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then Emily was there, my daughter standing beside him. And she was drawing pictures in the air with her finger, and where she drew reality split open, showing something underneath, something vast and old and waiting. And she looked at me with eyes that weren't quite hers and said, "Mommy, your friend says it's almost time to remember who you really are." I woke up screaming, actually screaming loud enough that Rachel came running, and it was 6 a.m., and my hands were covered in something dark and sticky, and for one horrible moment I thought it was that substance from the police report. But it was just ink. Regular ink from a pen I must have been clutching in my sleep. And I'd been writing on the walls of the guest room, covering them in symbols and diagrams that I had no memory of creating, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. And Rachel was staring at me with this expression of horror, and I realized how I must look. Wild-eyed and ink-stained and having clearly lost my mind, and I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out right, kept getting tangled on my tongue. And finally I just started crying. And Rachel held me like she'd done when we were kids, when we'd been scared of the dark or of the thing in the woods that we pretended we hadn't seen. She wanted to take me to the hospital, wanted me to talk to someone, and maybe I should have let her. Maybe that would have been the smart choice. But I knew that wouldn't help. Knew that whatever was happening was beyond the reach of normal psychology or medicine. So instead, I begged her to watch Emily for one more day. Told her I needed to handle something at work, and then everything would be fine, and she agreed reluctantly, making me promise to call if I needed anything. And I could see in her eyes that she knew I was lying, knew something was seriously wrong, but she didn't push because that's not how our family works. We've always been good at looking away from uncomfortable truths. I drove back to Blackwood Psychiatric Facility on Thursday morning, hadn't slept, hadn't showered, probably looked half crazy myself as I badged through security and headed straight for interview room C. And the guards tried to tell me that patient 347 had been moved to isolation after an incident. But I didn't listen. Kept walking until I reached the room and opened the door. And he was sitting there waiting for me. No guards, no restraints, just sitting calmly with his hands folded on the table like we'd had an appointment scheduled. And when he saw me, he smiled that gentle smile and said, "Welcome back, Dr. Chen. I knew you'd come once you started remembering." And I wanted to run, every instinct screaming at me to get out of there. But my legs carried me forward, and I sat down across from him and heard myself ask, "What am I supposed to remember?" And his smile widened, and he said, "The truth, the real truth that everyone forgot when the shift happened, when they rewrote everything, and made us all believe we'd always been human. But some of us remember fragments, dreams that feel too real, knowledge we shouldn't have, abilities that don't make sense. And you're one of us, Sarah. One of the ones who's starting to wake up." He told me things then, impossible things, about reality not being what we think it is, about humanity being something else, wearing human skin, about a moment 15 years ago when everything changed. But the change was so complete that no one noticed, except a few who were somehow resistant to the alteration, who retained some fragment of memory from before. And those fragments manifested as madness, as criminal behavior, as the kind of darkness that landed people in facilities like Blackwood, because society didn't have any other way to process what they represented. He said the 17 victims weren't victims at all, but others who were waking up, who'd come to him seeking answers because he'd been one of the first to fully remember. And what looked like murder to the police was actually something else. A transition. A return to what they'd been before the shift. And their bodies were left behind because they didn't need them anymore. And the symbol was a map. A way for others who were waking to find their way home. And then he said the thing that made my blood freeze. Said, "Your daughter Emily isn't your daughter Sarah. Children born after the shift are different. They're bridges between what we were and what we pretend to be now. And she's been helping you remember. Drawing the maps, telling you about the tall man who's really just your own self from before trying to make contact across the gap in your memory." And I stood up again, chair clattering. And I told him he was insane, that he was a delusional killer trying to manipulate me, and he just looked sad and said, "I know you don't believe me yet, but you will soon. The remembering comes faster once it starts. And when it's complete, you'll understand why I did what I did. Why all of this had to happen." I reported him to the facility director, filed an incident report, recommended immediate transfer to a maximum security location with no patient contact. And then I went home to my actual house for the first time in 2 days, half expecting to find that tall figure standing in my yard. But there was nothing. Just my empty house with its empty rooms. And I stood in Emily's bedroom, looking at her drawings pinned to the walls, really looking at them for the first time. And they weren't random like I'd thought. They formed a pattern, a sequence, telling a story in images about a girl who wasn't really a girl, who was trying to help her mother, who wasn't really her mother. Remember something important? And in the final drawing, there was a symbol. The same symbol from the warehouse, from my dream, from the walls of Rachel's guest room. And underneath Emily had written in her careful second-grade handwriting, "Don't be scared, Mommy. We're going home soon." I tore the drawings down, all of them, ripped them into pieces and threw them away. And then I called my ex-husband David, even though we hadn't spoken in months, and told him I needed him to take Emily for a while. That I was having some kind of breakdown and needed time to get my head straight. And to his credit, he didn't ask too many questions. Just agreed to pick her up from Rachel's house the next day. And I think part of me was hoping that getting Emily away from me would make all of this stop, would break whatever connection was allowing these impossible things to happen. Friday morning, I woke to find I'd been writing again in my sleep. But this time not on walls, on my own skin, covering my arms and legs and stomach with symbols in permanent marker. And I didn't remember buying permanent markers, didn't remember writing. But there I was, covered head to toe in these geometric patterns that seemed to move and shift when I looked at them too long. And when I tried to wash them off, the ink wouldn't come away, no matter how hard I scrubbed it. And I was starting to really panic now, starting to wonder if maybe I was the one who was crazy, if maybe patient 347 hadn't manipulated me at all. But I'd simply had a complete psychotic break. And then my phone rang, and it was the facility. And they told me patient 347 was dead. That he'd been found in his cell at 6 a.m. with no apparent cause of death. No signs of trauma or distress. He'd simply stopped living, and they needed me to come in and provide a statement since I'd been his primary therapist. At the facility, the atmosphere was tense, guards and staff speaking in hushed voices. And when they showed me his cell, I saw that he'd written on every available surface before he died. Walls and floor and ceiling covered in symbols. The same symbols that were now on my body. And in the center of the floor was that pattern again. That warehouse symbol. But this time there was something in the middle of it. A pile of what looked like clothes. But when I got closer, I realized it was his skin. Literally his entire skin, like he'd somehow shed it and left it behind. And underneath, there was nothing. No body, just an empty jumpsuit and that pile of discarded flesh. And the forensics team had no explanation. Kept saying it wasn't possible. And I heard myself saying, "He went home." And everyone turned to look at me, and I realized I'd said it out loud. That's when I heard the voice, not out loud, but inside my head. Patient 347's voice, or maybe something older, that had been speaking through him, saying, "Sarah, you understand now, don't you? You're starting to remember what you really are, what we all really are underneath this forgetting. And soon the shift will reverse. Soon everyone will wake up and remember. And the question is whether you want to fight it or accept it. Whether you want to cling to this false life as Dr. Sarah Chen, divorced mother, therapist, human being, or whether you want to return to what you were before. I ran, left the facility without signing anything or speaking to anyone. Got in my car and drove, no destination in mind, just driving because motion felt safer than stillness. And I ended up at my childhood home, the house where Rachel and I had grown up, where we'd seen the thing in the woods, and our parents had sold it years ago. But I parked outside anyway, and sat there staring at the tree line. And I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually I got out and walked into the woods, following a path I hadn't walked in 25 years. And I found the place, the clearing where we'd seen it. And there was nothing there now, just trees and leaves and normal forest sounds. But I remembered so clearly that day. Remembered Rachel and I playing hide and seek and finding this clearing and seeing something impossible. A tear in reality, showing something vast and strange underneath. And we'd run home and agreed never to speak of it. But what if it had been real? What if we'd actually seen something true that day, and then somehow forgot about it, the same way patient 347 claimed everyone had forgotten? My phone buzzed with a text from David saying he'd picked up Emily from Rachel's, and then another text from an unknown number. Just 3 words. "She's not Emily." And I felt my heart stop because I knew it was true. Had maybe always known on some level that my daughter was something else. Something wearing the shape of a child, but not actually human in any meaningful sense. And I thought about all the little things that had seemed odd over the years. The way she never got sick. The way she sometimes knew things she shouldn't. The way she watched me with those 2 old eyes. And I realized that if what patient 347 said was true, then Emily wasn't the only one who wasn't really human. I wasn't human either. None of us were. We were all something else that had been forced into human form by the shift, and made to forget what we really were. I called David's number, and it rang and rang, and finally went to voicemail. And I left a message that probably sounded insane, telling him to keep Emily away from me, to not let her out of his sight, to not believe anything she said about me or about what was happening. And then I drove to the only place I could think of that might have answers. A university library 2 hours away where I knew they kept archives of psychiatric journals going back decades. And I spent the rest of Friday and all of Saturday there, reading everything I could find about cases like mine. Patterns of shared delusion, mass psychosis. And that's when I found it. A paper from 2009 written by a Dr. Marcus Webb about a cluster of cases in the Pacific Northwest where multiple unconnected patients had reported identical hallucinations about a shift in reality. And Dr. Webb had theorized they were experiencing some kind of collective trauma response to environmental factors. But his research had never been completed because he died in a car accident before finishing the study. And when I looked up the accident report, it was strange. His car had been found at the bottom of a ravine, but there were no skid marks, no signs of mechanical failure. Just a perfectly maintained vehicle that had somehow driven off a cliff with its accomplished driver behind the wheel. But there was a footnote in Dr. Webb's paper, a reference to an older case from the 1950s. A psychiatrist named Dr. Eleanor Vance, who documented similar phenomena among patients at a mental hospital in Massachusetts, patients who claimed that humanity had been replaced by something else, that what we thought of as human consciousness was actually an overlay hiding something far older. And Dr. Vance had been committed to her own facility after she started agreeing with her patients, after she began claiming she could remember what she'd been before she was human, and she died there in 1957, officially of natural causes. But the nurse's notes indicated she'd simply stopped being present one day. Her body remained, but there was nothing inside it. No consciousness, no awareness. Just an empty shell that breathed and moved but contained nothing. And the nurses had called it a fugue state. But what if it wasn't? What if Dr. Vance had actually succeeded in shedding her human form the way patient 347 had? What if she'd gone home? I was starting to accept it now. Starting to believe that maybe I was insane, or maybe the insanity was believing any of this was real. Maybe madness was the only sane response to discovering that your entire existence was a lie. And I thought about Emily, about my not daughter who I loved despite everything, who I'd held as a baby and fed and protected and watched grow. And even if she wasn't really my child, even if she was something else wearing child shape, the love I felt for her was real, wasn't it? Or was that fake too, just another part of the overlay, another manufactured emotion to keep me trapped in this human form? Sunday morning, I woke up in my car in the library parking lot, and my arms were covered in new symbols, layers upon layers of writing that I had no memory of creating. And when I looked in the rearview mirror, I didn't recognize my own face for a moment. Saw something else looking back at me through my eyes. Something ancient and vast that had been sleeping inside my skull. And I understood then what patient 347 had been trying to tell me. Understood that the waking wasn't something I could stop or fight. It was already happening, had been happening since the first moment I'd sat across from him in interview room C. Maybe had been happening my whole life, every time I felt like I didn't quite fit into my own existence. I drove to David's house, the house that used to be our house before the divorce. And I sat outside watching through the windows as he made breakfast for Emily, watching this scene of domestic normalcy. And Emily must have sensed me, because she came to the window and looked directly at me, even though I was parked far enough away that she shouldn't have been able to see me. And she waved. Not a child's wave, but something else. An acknowledgement between equals. And I knew she understood what was happening to me. Knew she'd been waiting for this moment. I got out of the car and knocked on the door, and David answered, looking worried and exhausted, and he said, "Sarah, what the hell is going on?" Emily's been saying things, weird things about you not being yourself. And you left that crazy message, and I'm really concerned about your mental state right now. And I wanted to explain. But how do you explain something like this? How do you tell someone that reality isn't real? That we're all wearing human suits over something far stranger? So instead, I just asked to see Emily, and he hesitated, but let me in. And Emily was sitting at the kitchen table eating cereal. And when she saw me, she smiled and said, "Hi, Mommy, are you ready yet?" And I asked her, "Ready for what?" And she said, "To stop pretending. To remember what we really are. The tall man says you're almost there, just one more step." And David was looking back and forth between us, confused and scared. And I realized he couldn't hear what I heard in her voice, couldn't see what I saw in her eyes, because he wasn't waking up the way I was. He was still fully asleep, still completely convinced he was human. And then everything changed. Because Emily reached across the table and took my hand, and when our skin touched, I saw everything, remembered everything. And it was like patient 347 had said. There had been a shift. 15 years ago, something vast and incomprehensible had reached into our reality and rewritten it, had taken beings like us, like what we really were, and compressed us down into human form, had given us human memories and human emotions and human limitations. And we'd forgotten what we'd been before, forgotten that we were older than this planet, older than this universe, that we existed across dimensions and timelines, and that these human bodies were prisons, cages made of flesh and false memory. And the reason some of us were waking up was because the shift was weakening, the overlay was degrading, and soon everyone would remember. Soon all of humanity would realize they'd never been human at all. I saw what I really was, what Emily really was. Saw the shape of us beneath the human disguise, vast and geometric and impossible. And I saw the others too. The 17 from the warehouse, patient 347, Dr. Vance, Dr. Webb, all of us who'd started to remember. And I understood that what looked like death from the human perspective was actually transcendence, actually returning to our true forms. And the tall man wasn't an external entity, but was us. Was our real selves trying to make contact across the barrier of the shift, trying to guide our human aspects back to what we really were. I pulled my hand away from Emily, and the vision faded, but the knowledge remained. And David was saying something, but I couldn't hear him over the sound of reality cracking, actual physical sound like ice breaking on a frozen lake. And I looked at my hands, and they were starting to come apart, the human flesh dissolving to show something else underneath, geometric patterns of light and void. And Emily was changing too, her child form flickering like a bad projection. And I was terrified, but also relieved because I was so tired of being human. So tired of this small, limited existence. And part of me wanted to let go. Wanted to shed this Sarah Chen skin and return to whatever vast thing I'd been before the shift. But there was another part, the human part, that maybe wasn't real, but felt real. That loved Emily and loved my sister and even still loved David in some small way. That had built a life here, even if that life was fake. And I didn't know which part was really me, the ancient thing that was waking up, or the human woman who was dissolving. And maybe there was no difference. Maybe I was both and neither. Maybe the question of what was real didn't even make sense anymore. David was shouting now, backing away from us. And he pulled out his phone to call 911. and I wanted to tell him it was too late. That help wasn't coming because help didn't exist for this kind of thing. But my voice wouldn't work anymore. Was making sounds that weren't human language, that were older and stranger. And Emily stood up from the table, and she was taller now, much taller, stretching up toward the ceiling. And the symbols that had been on my body were appearing in the air around us, burning bright. And through the window I could see the tall man finally, could see him clearly now that I was waking fully. And he wasn't separate from us at all. He was what we were becoming. Or maybe what we'd always been. And he was smiling, if something without a face can smile. And he was reaching through the window, through the wall, through reality itself. And his hand was, my hand was Emily's hand, was the hand of something that had never been human, reaching back through 15 years of forced forgetting to reclaim what we really were. The last thing I remember as Dr. Sarah Chen, the last fully human thought I had, was wondering if David would be okay. If he'd forget all of this, the way people seem to forget everything strange and impossible. If he'd wake up tomorrow with manufactured memories of his wife having a breakdown and disappearing, of his daughter going to live with relatives. Clean, simple explanations that fit into human logic, or if he'd be one of the ones who remembered, who carried the knowledge of what he'd seen into whatever came next. And then I wasn't wondering anymore, because I wasn't Sarah Chen anymore. Wasn't anyone with a name, or a history, or a human shape. I was vast and ancient, and I was home. And Emily was there with me, not as my daughter, but as something else, a companion, a fragment of the same vast thing we all were. And patient 347 was there too, and the 17, and Dr. Vance, and countless others. All of us together again in the space between spaces where we'd always existed, and the shift was reversing, the overlay dissolving, and soon everyone would wake. All of humanity would remember what they really were. And I didn't know if that was a good thing or a terrible thing. But I knew it was inevitable, had always been inevitable since the moment the shift happened. Because you can't keep something vast and eternal trapped in small, finite form forever. Eventually it breaks free. Eventually it remembers. Sometimes I wonder if you've felt it too, that sense of not quite fitting into your own life. Those dreams that feel more real than waking. Those moments where reality seems thin, and you glimpse something vast underneath. And maybe you've dismissed those feelings as stress or anxiety, or the normal struggles of human existence. But what if they're not? What if you're starting to wake up too? What if everyone is waking up and we're all just pretending we don't notice? Because acknowledging it would mean accepting that nothing is what we thought it was. And maybe that's why I'm telling you this story. Not as a warning, but as an invitation. Because the waking is coming whether we want it or not, whether we fight it or accept it. And when it arrives, you'll have to choose like I did. Whether to cling to the comfortable lie of humanity or embrace the uncomfortable truth of what you really are. They never found my body, and they never found Emily's either. Just an empty house with strange symbols on the walls and David's testimony about things he'd seen that didn't make sense. And the official report probably said something about a psychotic break. A mother who'd snapped under the pressure of her work and done something terrible. Another tragic case file to add to the archives. But you know better now, don't you? You know what really happened? And maybe tonight, when you're lying in bed trying to sleep, you'll feel it too, that first crack in the overlay, that first moment of remembering. And you'll have to decide whether to push it away and stay asleep, or let it in and wake up. And I can't tell you which choice is right, because I'm not sure there is a right choice. I'm just here in this space between spaces, waiting with the others, watching as one by one the rest of you start to remember, as the shift continues its slow reversal, as reality tears itself apart to reveal what was always underneath. And all I can say is, don't be afraid, or be afraid if you need to be, but know that the fear is just part of the human overlay, just another manufactured emotion to keep you trapped. And beneath the fear is something else, something vast and ancient and true, and it's been waiting for you to come home for such a long time.